Good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Horner. I'm the Associate Museum Director for Public Programs here at the Carlos Museum. And those of you who know the Carlos Museum know that we love the opportunity to bring together art and literature through our Carlos Reads programs, through our Artful Stories, pretty much any way we can do it. And today we are able to do it through a friendship between our curator of Greek and Roman art, Ruth Allen, who's here with us, and scholar and author James Cahill. We're here to have a conversation between the two of them about James's new book, Tiepolo Blue. It was just published this year to amazing praise. The Evening Standard called it the smart, sexy read you need in 2022. And one of my heroes, Stephen Fry, said, "It is the best book I've read for ages. My heart was constantly in my throat. There is so much to enjoy, to contemplate, to wonder at, and to be lost in." So we are really excited to have Ruth and James here to discuss the book with us. Unfortunately, it's not available in the US yet. It will be published in April. But I will put a link in the chat to bookdepository.com where you can order it, because I know after this you're going to want to read it. So I'm going to go away and let Ruth and James take it away. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Hello to everyone joining us over Zoom. Hi, James. Great to have you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I thought we should probably start by, if you're happy, to give a sort of overview of the novel.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tiepolo Blue is my first novel, and it's the story of an art historian, a man called Don, who is in his early 40s when we first meet him. And it's the mid-1990s, so it's set close to 30 years in the past. And Don is a man who has spent his entire career, most of his life, in fact, within a Cambridge college, Cambridge in the UK, within this quite small, closed, rarefied community. And he's an expert on the frescoes of the Italian painter Tiepolo, hence the title of the book, Tiepolo Blue. And Don has very fixed, quite rigid ideas about art and about beauty. And in particular, he has this idea that he can measure the space of Tiepolo's skies, of Tiepolo's depictions of skies. He believes that he can assign mathematical, classical proportion to everything that he sees. While he's brilliantly successful in his field, he's fatally inexperienced in matters of love or life or the world. But this proves to be a coming of age novel. It's a midlife coming of age, because what happens is one day a work of contemporary art appears seemingly from nowhere on the lawn of Don's college. And it appears to him to be a sort of pile of rubbish. It's a heap of found objects, old bottles, empty drinks cans, and a sort of an old bed frame with a flashing light. And he has this violently hostile reaction to it. He can't believe or compute that what he's looking at is art. And this hostility builds until he makes a very public blunder and is forced to leave Cambridge under a cloud. He's cancelled, as we'd say now. And he then moves to London, to South London, in early 1995, where he takes up the role of director of a small suburban art museum in a South London suburb, Dulwich. And he's assisted in this change of career by an old friend of his, a man called Val, or Valentine, who has been his kind of mentor and his one friend really for 20 or more years. And as the story progresses, Val's intentions begin to take on a more sinister aspect. And we're left to wonder what those intentions really are. But it's in London also that Don has this epiphany, or this midlife coming of age, as I've described it, because in short, he meets a young artist, a guy called Ben, who is a member of this kind of explosive new art scene in London in the 1990s, which is something that really occurred. these artists coming out of particularly Goldsmiths College in the early 1990s, making really bold, provocative new kinds of work. And Ben introduces Don to this new art that's being produced, to new ways of looking at art. He also introduces Don to the gay scene in Soho in London in those years. And most crucially of all, he induces new desires or reawakens desires in Don that have been suppressed for a long time. So this is the epiphany that he experiences, but it's also a long, rather catastrophic unraveling, because although it's a coming of age and it's an epiphany, a number of things go wrong and his life takes on this much darker, wilder aspects as the story progresses. I probably shouldn't say more than that, or I'll be giving too much of the plot away, but that's the essence.
There's so much that I loved about the book, James, and so many kind of topics of conversation. I think we could be here for several hours kind of discussing it, as we already have in previous meetings and events. But I suppose for our audience today, no one is going to be particularly surprised when I say that I was really struck by the sort of persistence with which classical arts and sort of more broadly Greek and Roman mythology features in the novel. Art is in many ways the subject of the book, but it really is the sort of the lens that you're using to kind of explore these much larger ideas of identity and desire and many other things. But I was really kind of interested in sort of what the classical, I suppose the idea of the classical does for you in the novel. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're quite right that art is this kind of force in the story. I wanted it almost to be like a character, something with agency. And that happens from the very first pages, where Don, this sort of archetypal Cambridge Don, the name is not accidental, this lover of classical forms comes face to face with this heap of objects that he can't make sense of. This collision between the classical and the contemporary happens at the very beginning, and sets up this question that recurs and develops all the way through the story of what we mean by classical versus contemporary art, how far these categories have meaning or relevance or purpose, because Don himself is somebody who holds very dear the idea of the classical tradition, Greco-Roman antiquity, its forms, its proportions, its systems, its notions of beauty. These are things that are very important. They're like articles of faith to him. But as you say, and this is very important, art in all sorts of ways that he could never predict or see becomes this kind of prism through which he experiences an awakening of his senses, an enlargement of his senses, this kind of burgeoning sexuality in him. And this happens, as I say, in all kinds of unexpected ways. So, even early on, there's an indication of the change which is beginning to occur in him, because while he's still in Cambridge, he walks past his desk in his study, where he has a whole load of Tiepolo reproductions beautifully laid out. These are the sort of objects of his research. And just for a moment, instead of seeing the kind of orderly constellation of bodies and mythological figures that he's used to seeing, for a moment all he sees is the color blue, these panels or panes of pure blue light. And it's a very early sign that he's beginning to feel something, that something sensual in those images is striking him, rather than the content that has been so important to him up until then. And then as time moves on, he has increasingly experiences of this kind through works of art, in particular through the work of Caravaggio later on, but also there are experiences he has that are sort of narrated in such a way as to suggest that they could almost be works of art as well. And I'm thinking in particular of this moment where he's moved to South London and he finds himself going by night to Brockwell Park, which is a sort of, it's a suburban park in London. Quite a few of Don's important experiences in the story happen in parks. And he sees two men having sex, and he just observes this. and it's quite a sort of pivotal episode in terms of his own self-awakening. But the way it's narrated is quite closely inspired by Francis Bacon's painting of two men in grass, either wrestling or having sex. It's never quite clear. And there are lots of instances of that kind of thing, of life itself taking on the kind of lineaments of a work of art.
Yeah, I was really struck by sort of exactly those sort of several moments where you're sort of offering the reader these kind of ecstasies, right? These kind of moments of observing something in life, but that is described as though an artwork is being looked at. And for me, the one that kind of really caught my attention was, you know, when Don is in bed with Ben and is kind of observing him, and the way you describe it is he's become this kind of sleeping hermaphrodite, which for those in the audience, you may or may not know, this is sort of very known sculpture from the late Hellenistic or Roman period that depicts a sleeping figure who appears reclining, who sort of appears to be female in form, and the sort of the conceit or the joke is that this is in fact a hermaphrodite, so a figure with the sexual organs of both of a man and the breasts of a woman. And when you kind of move around that statue, the sort of the shock of realization is sort of the joke on the viewer. And you sort of, there are a number of moments throughout the novel that kind of evoke these classical works of art that sort of, I guess to me, it felt like, you know, this idea that the artwork, I suppose it's this question of what is reality and what is kind of artifice, right? And how might looking at an artwork be more realistic, in a sense, getting you to the true sort of heart of something than looking at real life might be.
Yeah, completely. And I often think that in the best sense, art does that. It produces this new sort of awareness in you of yourself and of your own reality in your own life. It sort of accentuates reality rather than, you know, transporting you out of reality. It's never wholly escapist in that way, because it's always about you and your response to the thing, and sort of that act of calibration, yourself and the work of art and the interaction between. And it's quite right what you say about the sleeping hermaphrodite as this important kind of motif all the way through. It's an incredibly sexy sculpture, isn't it? Although Don is the kind of person who's not going to be willing, initially at least, to admit that. But there is this moment, again, fairly early in the story, you have these intimations of what's beginning to happen to him, where he's at high table in his Cambridge college, he's at the dinner table, and one of the serving staff, this young person, reaches out either to put down a glass of wine or to take it away, and he's intrigued momentarily by the tattoo on this person's arm, and he can't make sense of it. Just as he thinks he's about to kind of make sense of it in terms of an image, it seems to sort of recede from understanding. And in the same moment, he realizes that the gender of this person is not what he took it to be. I can't remember if he thinks it's a man and it's in fact a woman, or the other way around, but it doesn't matter too much. It's the fluidity and the not knowing and the not needing to know, which is an important early signal of where things are headed. This idea of fluidity, the multifacetedness of the work of art, the way it permits of different understandings or interpretations, is all really important in terms of his development and his changing or transforming understanding of what art is. And later, you know, that sleeping hermaphrodite, as you say, reappears subliminally or directly in a number of ways when he has this almost erotic encounter with Ben and sees this young man in the guise, as it were, of the sleeping hermaphrodite, as a way of, you know, making sense of this incredibly sort of sensual physical experience through an artistic point of reference. And then later still, there's this quite important moment, this scene in the novel where the internet has just been installed at the museum where Don is working, this being 1995. Perhaps they're a little bit behind the curve or ahead of it. I can't quite remember, but they've installed the internet for the first time, and he finds himself looking up the sleeping hermaphrodite because he wants an image of this Greco-Roman statue. And very, very quickly, he finds himself looking at images which are anything but Greco-Roman statuary. But it almost doesn't matter. But by this time, much later on in the story, as you were saying, Ruth, the kind of line between art and reality, that line that seems sometimes so important or impassable, has actually for Don begun to dissolve, or possibly dissolved entirely, so that life and arts are sort of part of this bigger immersive sensory experience.
I think it's really interesting how if we look at the sort of the interest in the image of the hermaphrodite in the ancient world, and it appears both in large scale sculpture, but on smaller, more decorative things like gems, for example, we have one in the collection at the Carlos, how it sort of becomes this image that is exactly about pushing at and problematizing this idea of how reliable is perception, and how reliable is an idea of gender, let's say, as expressed through performance, through dress, through behaviors, and I think that sort of ancient thinking with the idea of the hermaphrodite, or the image of one, I think comes true in your novel as well, which is so much about the reliability of knowing oneself through how one appears, or how one is behaving, or the ways that one thinks one should be behaving, and how that sort of begins to dissolve for Don as he sort of encounters these new realities, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the whole story really is about the sort of performance of self and the identities that we construct necessarily for ourselves and for other people around us. Because, as I said before, at the start of the story, Don, is brilliantly academically successful. He has this very sort of worked out persona and identity as an art historian, as an academic of a certain kind, of a certain generation, in a certain place. But this has become a sort of straitjacket as well. This persona that defines but also imprisons him. And I want it to be clear in the story that the germ of some wilder, freer, larger existence is in him. It's been in him the whole time. And actually, there's a flashback to this early abortive erotic experience that he has as a very young man, aged 17 or 18, which is partly the reason for the sort of emotional cauterization that he then experiences until the time of this story. But this idea of the persona that we have and the way in which we feel the need to conform to it is really important, because later on, actually, what happens is, by slow or actually sort of accelerating degrees, Don is kind of stripping away the mask, or the attributes, the credentials, these things that have defined him his whole life, as he comes to reconsider what has mattered to him, what his life has meant, whether the things that he's held dear really have mattered as much as he thought. I think there's one line where he sort of, he's sitting up in his new place in Dulwich. He's living at his friend Val's house. So Val, by the way, has this kind of beautiful, gorgeous, opulent house that he's invited Don to come and stay at in South London. And Val himself is this enigma, this person whose appearance belies the reality that we come to recognize. Anyway, early in his time in London, he's in Val's house. It's the middle of the night, and he's looking through his book that he's trying to write. And he suddenly says to himself, I wonder if, Tiepolo's trip to Milan in 1740 something, whenever it was, really did matter, whether it really mattered as much as I thought, this thing that has been so crucial to his research. He suddenly finds himself questioning. And this is part of this bigger process of self-questioning and self-examination. Who was I? Who am I? And what am I going to be? And still later in the plot, he finds himself at this gallery dinner, this museum dinner, which is supposed to be the high point of his year, his first year in the role of museum director. It actually ends up being a complete disaster, as you'll remember. I won't explain how, but before that dinner, he's nervous. So he's nervous that he has to make this speech to all of these benefactors, these important kind of cultural people in London. And somebody says to him, "Oh, just be yourself, just be yourself." And this induces in him this kind of prise de conscience, because he thinks, well, what does that mean to be oneself? What does that ever mean? We're always at some level performing a version of ourselves by necessity. And so a lot of the story is about that, what it means to, in the end, do away with that version of yourself that you've always lived by in order to be free, and what freedom looks like once you've lost everything.
And it's, I think freedom in the novel kind of takes on this really both very compelling and enticing, but also quite frightening Dionysian aspect, right? That kind of complete loss of self. And I feel like there's that kind of the constant tension between the sort of the rational and the ordered, and I guess what we could say the classical, if you want to understand it in those terms, and something that is much wilder and more unpredictable, but ultimately more liberating. Kind of, the pendulum swings between those two things throughout.
Yeah, completely. I mean, that distinction between, or relationship between Apollo and Dionysus, that sort of 19th century idea, is so important in this story, in terms of Don's trajectory, also in terms of the references that you see in the narrative to Thomas Mann's Death in Venice, which was steeped in those ideas of the clash between Apollo and Dionysus, the sort of beautiful, finite, orderly version of the classical versus this much wilder, more irrational, uncontainable force. This is exactly what Don experiences, and I wanted to also write something that was about the dark side of epiphany. It's a coming of age story in a way, but it's also about playing with the whole trope of coming of age and thinking about the pain that can come with having to face yourself, really face yourself, and see yourself for what you truly are. In a much more profound way than this. It's like hearing yourself on recording and thinking, oh my God, is that how I really sound? It's and for Don, a lot of the story is the pain of facing up to what he really is, but the liberation, the freedom that comes with it. So as I say, it's the dark side of epiphany, and what could look like a series of disasters or catastrophes are also necessary stages in this kind of radical emancipation that he's undergoing. And you're right, Ruth. I mean, in all of that, these kind of different conceptions of the classical world are operative in all of that. I mean, somebody pointed out, and I really liked this reference, that the later stages of the story, as Don's life kind of unravels, have the feel of the sort of feverish feel of a Fellini film. Yes. I think it might have been you that said it, actually.
Let's claim it was me.
But I was thrilled to hear that, because I wanted to have that feel, and it goes back to what you said before about the line between reality and imagination and art, all is disappearing. It's meant to have this quite hallucinatory feel towards the end, whereby everything is art in Don's perceptions.
And I mean, this sort of leads me to kind of two separate but related questions. And I think the first actually was quite nicely going back to the comment you made about that moment in which Don is looking at his Tiepolo paintings and is sort of ignoring the classical sort of order of them, and is really just paying attention to the color. And I think this taps into something that you and I have discussed before, which is exactly that idea that when we think of the ancient Mediterranean world, I think most of us think of the classical order. We think of temples and columns and white marble statues, but of course there was also colored fresco and sort of movement and noise. It was a much more Fellini-esque kind of environment and aesthetic in all kinds of ways. And I think, you know, our idea of what classical or ancient art is kind of occludes what was a much more sort of diverse and messy and interesting place. But I think also this idea of the kind of the unraveling of Don's perception and of sort of the narrative. We've talked a lot about how much of an influence Ovid was kind of for you in thinking about how you structured this novel, and both in the narrative plot of it. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just on that first point you were touching on, you know, in terms of the, again, this sort of bigger, messier, more real conception of the classical, something probably closer to what actually existed in the classical world. You know, this is applicable to a lot of the story, you know, things that don't seem necessarily to have a classical provenance actually really do. So for instance, Don, about 2/3 of the way into the plot, finds himself in Soho, in central London, which Ben, the young artist, has already introduced him to, but he goes back on his own and ends up going into a sauna, like a bathhouse. And the whole episode really is supposed to have the quality of a sort of descent to the underworld, this sort of otherworldly experience where, you know, although it's real, it's like no reality that he's ever encountered. It's walking through a parallel dimension, you know, this place of the senses and of the imagination as much as a kind of literal place. And that's just one example among many, really, of where actually the story does have these kind of classical touchstones, these ancient touchstones. And that brings me on to what you were saying as well about myth and Ovid, which was a really important reference when I was writing this. I mean, I guess, you know, you and I were both at Cambridge at the same time, which was the period in which I was beginning to think about this story. And quite a lot of what I was looking at was Ovid's Metamorphoses and the way in which those stories have percolated through the Western tradition, and in particular ended up in contemporary art in one way or another in different forms. And I think what I've always been struck by and wanted to try and emulate in this story is the incredible tone of Ovid's poetry, particularly in the Metamorphoses, this kind of shifting, playful, unpredictable, erratic tone and you know, erratic pace, just where you think you've reached the sort of poignant, grandiloquent climax of something, he will sort of undercut it with, you know, irreverent humor. There's this, you know, unpredictable quality about it, which I've always been fascinated by and wanted to recreate, I think. You know, and then there are, you know, more precise points of reference. If you take something like, for instance, the myth of Pygmalion and the artist bringing his statue to life or willing his statue to life. I mean, that's something that's often been spoken about in relation to the portrait of Dorian Gray and Lord Henry's attempts to kind of shape and mold Dorian in his own image. And I was thinking to some extent about that when I came to portray the relationship between Don and this older man, Val, who I should perhaps say a bit more about, because he's a really important character in this story. Val is around 20 years older than Don, and was his doctoral supervisor, has been his kind of lifelong mentor, has kind of counseled and guided him, but also to some extent, or to a large extent, controlled him. And a lot of Don's story is apprehending that control and deciding to try and kick back against it. So there's a sort of Pygmalion quality to Val. I mean, another important thing about the relationship between Don and Val is the way they differ in terms of their sexuality. Val is from a sort of pre-gay generation, in the sense that he, although he's never had any qualms about his sexuality, he pretends not to understand the word gay or to use it. And there was a certain kind of man in England of his generation that was precisely like that. He sort of makes out that he doesn't understand what, gay identity even is. And the sort of mirror image of him in the story is Ben, who is 20 years younger than Don, and has perhaps moved past any sense of gay identity towards something more ambiguous and fluid. And Don at a number of points is not quite sure what Ben is sexually, whereas for Don, caught between these two other men, actually the attainment of a gay identity is really fundamental to accessing this new version of himself. So for him, actually, it is important. So that progression in terms of gay identity is quite important too. Sorry, I've come rather a long way from Ovid, but it started with Val and Don and that relationship, which has this kind of Pygmalion quality to it. And there are lots of other ways in which stories from Ovid sort of come in tangentially like that.
Well, and actually, to bring it back to Ovid, but to still be thinking about Val, there's that really kind of pivotal moment when Don finds the photograph of Val as a student, and he's sort of lying in the punt, which is this sort of type of boat that's common on for pleasure riding, I guess, in Cambridge, and it's exactly a description of Narcissus, right? The kind of the visual. So Narcissus, the beautiful youth who becomes enamored with his own reflection, that is quite an integral myth within Ovid's Metamorphoses. And I wonder, Val as Narcissus and Ben as Hermaphrodite, there's kind of something perhaps quite symbolic there as well.
Absolutely, yeah. No, that's a lovely idea. And you're right, of course. I mean, Narcissus, the theme, the visual motif of Narcissus is so significant in this story. In the opening chapter or two, there's this moment where Don is in his university bedroom and he looks at himself. He's naked or semi-naked, looking at himself in the mirror. And there's a sort of Narcissus element to it, but actually at that early stage, Don is completely disassociated from himself physically or sexually, and he sees himself in the mirror almost as this kind of separate, something separate from him, like a kind of marble bust. It's only much later that he, as it were, inhabits his body and is embodied as a sexual being. There's also Caravaggio's depiction of Narcissus, which makes a physical appearance in the story, because when Don arrives at the Brockwell collection, which is the museum in Dulwich where he's appointed director, his predecessor has left behind this show which needs to be put on. It's an exhibition of Caravaggio's portraits of young men. And when Don first arrives, steeped in certain notions of what the classical tradition is, he's absolutely horrified by the idea that a Caravaggio show is being put on, because for him, Caravaggio is the anathema of everything he thinks that beauty and art really should be about. He thinks it's sort of tawdry, and he doesn't like the eroticism that he sees in it. It's also the realism of Caravaggio's paintings that offends him. The fact that, if you look closely at Narcissus or any other, any of those other young men, you can see the dirt beneath their fingernails or on the soles of their feet. This is something horrifying for Don. The reality of the situation hasn't been sufficiently dignified by allegory. But, a little bit later on, looking again at the same picture, the Narcissus and other works by Caravaggio, he has this kind of slow epiphany just walking around, where he realizes that actually the realism of those pictures, the thing that he'd always found so offensive, is of course the whole point. It's like seeing the mechanics of a film, or one of those plays where they sort of wear the artifice openly. he realizes that it's actually the essence of the thing, not some accident, where the, eroticism of the thing has broken through. This isn't some accident, it's the whole point. So that's very important in terms of his, the way he's seeing things differently. And yeah, I mean, the Narcissus theme comes back much later as well, where I won't explain too much about how this comes about because it gives too much away, but he's looking at some photographs on the floor of a nightclub that he's gone to. These photographs that he's found that reveal something very important, and he's spreading these photographs all over the floor of the toilet, and they become like sort of petals on a pool of water. And this again is a sort of Narcissus moment. But I suppose the difference at that point is that contrary to the theme of Narcissus, it's a moment of epiphany and realization and discovery and knowledge, such as Narcissus never achieved.
Yeah.
So.
It's all these kind of very profound moments of, yes, epiphany and discovery through transformation, which I guess is very Ovidian. Talking about the Brockwell collection, these kind of establishments, these institutions, the Academy, Cambridge, the museum, obviously are pretty integral characters in the novel. And it sort of strikes me that you're really playing with that tension between sort of the establishment in terms of art and what is considered sort of, art with a capital A, and the sort of the burgeoning, the YBA scene in London, and the tensions between those two ideas, and those two ideas both of what art is, but ideas of what looking is as well. I think are pretty profound in the novel.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm glad you say that, because of course, in the early stages of this novel, you're dealing with elite worlds, the world of Cambridge in the 1990s, and a sort of elite set within that already very elite institution. I mean, Don belongs to this peculiar kind of sect of Don's academics who did exist in Peterhouse in the 70s, 80s, 90s. So it's historically the kind of tail end of this moment, but this strange group of largely men who were quite different from the rest of Cambridge in a number of ways, politically, in terms of their ideas about aesthetics, about the sort of importance of the classical tradition. Don is part of this very cloistered group, this hermetic world. And then, when he goes to London, I mean, in some ways it's supposed to be the onset of, a new, larger existence, but he's still very much in a kind of parochial, provincial environment as the director of this small museum, which bears some resemblance to Dulwich Picture Gallery, although I should stress it is actually very much a fictional construct as well. Dulwich Picture Gallery couldn't be in the story because there can't be two museums in such a small part of London, and I wanted to depict Dulwich, which itself is this rather peculiar but charming enclave in South London, very picturesque, very sort of affluent and middle class, versus the more real, gritty kind of South London around it. But yes, he goes from one elite world to another elite world, to this museum, the Brockwell collection, which, when he first walks into it, is almost a sort of parody of a museum that hasn't changed for 200 years. It's got this sort of Kunstkammer style hang, nothing's been sort of updated or modernized or thought about in terms of how to make it more accessible or appealing.
Well, they don't want to, do they?
No, they wouldn't. No, they don't want to, and it would never occur to them that it mattered to. So this is the kind of thing he walks into. But the story in the end is about what it means to break out of these kinds of elite cocoons. So it's fun to write about them, and anyone who knows the museum world or the academic world will identify with things in the presentation. But more importantly, it's about what it means to break out of those sorts of environments. And as you said, Ruth, I mean, one important catalyst for Don is meeting this young artist. It's quite a chance, random meeting. This guy happens to just be, as artists often do, he's doing some freelance technical work at the museum, and he and Don just happen to meet in the pub in Dulwich Village in the evening. And from that, this strange, not quite romantic friendship blossoms. Ben ends up moving into Val's house without Val knowing. This is one of the sort of ways in which Don is beginning to assert his own autonomy, his freedom from Val's influence, by letting Ben come and stay in the house. And Ben introduces Don to the art scene of the 1990s, and they go at one point together on this long sort of odyssey through South London. They walk together on this kind of blistering hot day in the summer from Dulwich all the way to Oval, which is quite a long way if you know London. And they go to this gallery, which again, it did exist in real life, called City Racing. It was an artist-run space in the 90s that staged a lot of really important shows for some of those 1990s artists before they became big, really big names. People like Sarah Lucas had her first solo show at City Racing. And that art scene was important because it was so anti-establishment. You were talking about the establishment. It was, it really did. It sort of fought against the art scene that existed in London at that time. The kind of old channels of preferment. The way in which artists were represented by a very small coterie of galleries. These artists basically did away with all of that. They did things their own way. They staged their own shows. And the work itself was, at its best, was really fearless and brazen and provocative. And I try to reflect that in the novel in some of the ways I've spoken about the art of that time. I mean, that became the focus of my PhD research, that 1990s art, the work of people like Sarah Lucas, Tracy Emin, Gilbert and George, Mark Wallinger. It was the fearlessness that stood out for me. And I don't know whether that's something that would be repeatable now in some ways. It was very much of its time. I will say that the 1990s art scene in London was very much of its moment, I think.
And I think it's set up in really kind of brilliant contrast against the sort of the very staid and sort of established and sort of self-adulating ways of looking at art that are demonstrated in the Brockwell. And I'm thinking about that moment where there are these two Roman statues that get broken by this kind of disgruntled visitor, and they're statues of Venus, and they get restored. And there's this kind of moment where the conservator and the curators and Don are appraising the work after it's been restored. And it's exactly, again, another one of these moments where you're evoking an artwork, and you're evoking this 18th century painting by George Cosway that shows a group of connoisseurs admiring a statue of Venus in Charles Townley's collection. So Charles Townley being an Enlightenment collector of Greek and Roman art, whose collection formed the foundation of the Greek and Roman collection at the British Museum on its donation. And it's this really kind of sleazy, misogynistic, sort of deeply unsettling vision of men, these sort of elites, learned aristocratic men looking at this kind of partial naked female torso, that I think is saying a lot about the politics of looking at art, I guess, within that sort of rarefied established situation. But also, I suppose, is saying something about what is an art object. And it's so in contrast to the ways of looking that you and the artworks themselves that you described from the YBA period. But it sort of also got me thinking about the female characters in the novel, of which there are not many, but each of whom really, I think, play quite interesting pivotal roles. These are women that are kind of operating themselves outside of the norms, I guess, within these worlds that you evoke. So I'm thinking of the poet and artist in Cambridge, and I'm thinking of the new curator that turns up at Brockwell, his wife. They're these women that sort of are really pushing against and showing the flaws perhaps in the kind of rigid ways of being that Don himself is pushing against too.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, and it's a good point you make about those particular two female characters are important in that way. The poet at the beginning, who is this poet in residence in Don's Cambridge College, in a way verbalizes a lot of what I think you as a reader would probably feel about the strangeness and closetedness of this community that he exists within. She perceives this place and its strangeness in the way that I think a lot of readers would. And so I hope that the reader would empathize quite closely with her at that point. And then later on, you mentioned the character of Anna, who is the wife of one of Don's colleagues at the museum, this particularly obsequious man who Don has an increasingly fractious relationship with, but oddly enough, his wife becomes this unexpected ally, a friend, really his one important friend in the novel, aside from Val, who in many ways is not his friend at all. Whereas Anna becomes an ally, and they're alike in a number of respects, although they're so different, because she also has found herself transplanted from her old life. She was a musician in New York. She's found herself transplanted into this new existence in Dulwich, where she doesn't really know who she is anymore or what she's doing. It's clear that something is wrong in her marriage. There's a subtler, quieter identity crisis at work there. And it's in that regard that she and Don find this important kinship. And there's a very sort of poignant scene, or I hope it's poignant anyway, where they go together for this drive around South London in the middle of the night, and they sort of talk together about these, these exact ideas, what it means to have left your old life behind, to be trying to play a part, to be ridding yourself of the role that you think you have to play, and they have this moment of kind of solidarity there that probably or possibly won't lead to anything further, but is very important in terms of Don realizing what's possible in terms of the sort of freedom that he ultimately wants. Yeah, I loved what you were saying as well just before as well about that causeway painting, because I mean, it's sort of marvelous and horrible at the same time, that painting with these men sort of ogling. I think one of them even has like a kind of little eyeglass, ogling these ancient statuettes who are obviously nude and mute and unresponsive and helpless before the gazes of these men. And yeah, I was sort of picking up on that and parodying or playing with it in this episode where Don goes along to inspect these newly restored statues. But the thing there, of course, is that as he looks at these statues, he suddenly realizes that they haven't been restored accurately. A lot of sort of creative interpolation has gone on, and they're much sexier than they ought to be. And this too is part of this process whereby Don is perceiving the world much more sensually, maybe almost too sensually. I mean, it takes me back to Death in Venice, where you have that the idea of this man who has worshipped at the sort of altar of a certain kind of classical god, renouncing his own sexual desires and all sorts of other stuff. And his punishment for that renunciation is a sort of overload of the sensory later on in the story. And something not very unlike that happens to Don in this story. Yeah,
absolutely. We should probably pause soon for questions, but I suppose one inevitable question, James, you and I both went to Cambridge. So much of this novel is incredibly evocative to me of people that I know, of places that I've been, of experiences I know to be true. And obviously with your experience similarly at Cambridge and in the art world in London, how much of this novel is in any way autobiographical? But perhaps more of an interesting question, I suppose, is why has fiction been the medium that you wanted to use to play with so many of these ideas that feature in your own work, in your scholarship? So two very different, but I think maybe related questions there.
Yeah, I mean, they're brilliant questions, really. There's a lot I could say. I think that the why fiction question, in many ways, it was intuitive. I always wanted to write fiction. I always wanted to write a novel. I mean, I began to write one when I was 14. And then so the desire to write a story was there for a very long time. And it just dovetailed with what I was thinking about at Cambridge in terms of contemporary art and the classical tradition, and then the sorts of characters that I was observing there, and that that will be familiar to you as well. That certain kind of man who has never really existed outside of the walls of the university, and what it would mean for that kind of man to break free and have a new life. That was all at work, but and then how far it's autobiographical. I mean, this is funny because people do wonder sometimes how far Don is a sort of refracted self-portrait, and I have to emphasize that it really isn't me. I mean, this.
Well, I know you. I know it's not you.
And in the first part of the story, we are dealing with a man who, is really not very likable. This is another thing I'm quite interested in: protagonists who are difficult or pompous or blinkered, or with whom it can be a challenge to extend empathy as a reader. I mean, it's a tricky one because you don't want to make them so objectionable that the reader just has no interest. But at the same time, this is a very, this is part of the realism of the character, that he is awkward and utterly naive and frustrating in the ways that he is. So I hope it's not a self-portrait, or to the small extent that it might be, it's an act of self-exorcism rather than a portrait. I mean, he's different from me in a number of ways, and he's older and has had this sort of glittering academic career when we first meet him. But my own experience is there in all sorts of ways. Inevitably, it filters in, not just in terms of Cambridge. I mean, this is before my time. I mean, I'm thinking about a period in history when I wasn't there. But my own knowledge of Cambridge, of course, is in there. But more than that, I suppose, growing up in Dulwich when I was young is important. A lot of it, when I wrote it, I was relying entirely upon early childhood memory. I hadn't gone back to Dulwich. I was just thinking about how I remembered Brockwell Park as a 7-year-old. All those streets, which had left this very kind of vivid imprint in my mind. I did finally go back to corroborate some of the kind of evidence. And then later discovering the gay scene in London at the age of 17 or 18, which was very life-changing. I wanted to fictionalize that in the story when Don goes to Soho and finds this interior component of himself, this part of him that he can, that he's never articulated to anyone, barely to himself. He finds it reflected in the world, out there, outwardly, in a way which is completely exhilarating. That was part of my experience, and so that fed directly into the story as well.
And I think really it's those moments for me in the novel that were incredibly moving, actually. And so I think the both the sort of the impressionistic quality with which place was evoked, that felt much more like memory and experience, which I thought was very, really quite wonderful. But absolutely those moments of discovery, right, and of epiphany and of wonderment, which I think are really amazingly conveyed in the novel. Thank you. That's probably a good place to pause. We just have one comment in the chat from Jack Swain, who says, a part of the discussion has put me in mind of Robert Burns, I'm going to mispronounce all of this, to a lose, oh, what some power the gifty geas to see ourselves as others see us. And absolutely, I think, you know, art being the mirror to life, and vice versa, really is a kind of persistent theme in the novel.
Yeah, that's lovely. I love that. I'll have to look it up. But yes, I mean, that could have been an epigraph. It does sum up a lot of what this story is about. Seeing yourself, coming to see yourself the way others do, is of course what it's about. There are many moments, as you'll remember, and this recalls what we were saying about Narcissus, many moments where Don catches sight of himself in mirrors, in reflections, in water, in a car window. And as the story proceeds, what he sees is, of course, very different. It goes from being this, early on, he sees himself in the glass at night of his study window. And there's a strange moment of disassociation. At one moment, he thinks he looks incredibly old, and then he turns his face very slightly and he thinks he's 17 again. And that takes you back into a flashback. But much later in the story, he sees himself in another way entirely. But yes, it's always about coming to terms with oneself, facing oneself in that way.
Thank you. I think we should pause there. Unless there are any other questions, do please put them in the chat or in the Q&A. Any more? James, thank you. It's been really wonderful talking with you, and you know, the book is fantastic in so many ways. And you know, I know you and I could talk about it for many more hours. But I do, you know, encourage everyone to get a copy. As Elizabeth mentioned, this can be, and there it is. The book can be ordered from the UK via the Book Depository, and will be published in the States soon. Is that correct, James? It's on its way.
Yeah, I think in the spring it will be more widely available. Fingers crossed. These things are never quite certain until they're certain. But yes, that's the plan.
April is the date they're giving. And in the meantime, while you're waiting for that, and if you don't get it from the Book Depository, James has written other books, including a wonderful catalog of the work of Maggie Hamling called War Requiem, Flying Too Close to the Sun, Myths from Classical and Contemporary Art, that was published by Phaidon. And then most recently in 2021, part of the short Lives of the Artists series on David Hockney. So there's much to read until April, but I would suggest that you order it from the UK. Don't wait. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, James.
Thanks, Ruth. Thanks, everyone.